You and I, we live in a world shaped by a massive global economy. It's a system that gets praised for lifting millions out of poverty, but also gets blamed for leaving so many others behind. So, how did we even get here? And is this incredibly interconnected system really the best we can do? Let's dig in and unpack the story of our global age. I love this quote. It just nails it, right? A decent, if flawed, choice. What that's really saying is, yeah, our market economy has some big problems, but maybe, just maybe, the alternatives are even worse. That's the idea we're going to chase today. We'll look at how this whole thing was built, who won big, and yeah, who got left behind. All right, so where does this story really kick off? Well, for what we're talking about, it basically explodes onto the scene right after the Cold War. I mean, the Soviet Union falls, and suddenly there's this new global agreement forming around market-based ideas. And that led to a boom in global trade like we'd never seen before. And the engine behind that whole boom? It was one big idea: economic liberalization. Now, what does that actually mean? Put simply, it's when governments kind of take their hands off the economic steering wheel and let free markets take over. This wasn't some accident, by the way. It was a philosophy, a deliberate choice, pushed by some of the most powerful people on the planet at the time. So, this free market revolution, it really had its champions. In fact, you could point to a pretty powerful duo, one on each side of the Atlantic, who really got the ball rolling. And their shared vision, well, it ended up reshaping the entire world economy for decades to come. And wow, the parallel is pretty striking when you look at it. Over in the US, you've got Ronald Reagan. In the UK, Margaret Thatcher. They were basically using the exact same playbook: cut taxes, slash regulations, and pull back on government aid. Now here's the irony. Both were super nationalistic, right? But their policies actually created huge incentives for their own corporations to pack up and move jobs overseas. That one move set off a chain reaction all over the world. And that chain reaction? It was like a set of dominoes falling, knocking over old economic models all across the globe. This wasn't just a US and UK thing anymore. Countries everywhere started trying out this free market approach, and the results, well, they were dramatic and sometimes wildly different from each other. Let's look at one of the first, and definitely one of the most controversial examples: Chile. This was under the military rule of Augusto Pinochet. So after a US-backed coup back in 1973, Chile just did a complete 180, turning away from state control and diving headfirst into a free market system. So you had this group of economists, they were called the Chicago Boys, and they brought in some really radical changes. They privatized businesses that used to be run by the state, and they got a handle on some serious inflation. I mean, prices were just spiraling out of control. And yeah, the economy grew, big time. But, and this is a huge but, this so-called economic miracle happened under a brutal dictatorship at a terrible cost to human rights. That makes Chile a really, really complicated story to tell. Okay, now let's jump to a totally different model: China. Under its leader Deng Xiaoping, China started carving out its own unique path. He had this famous saying, "Let some people get rich first." And that was a huge signal, a major shift away from pure communist ideas, even though the government kept a very tight grip on political power. And China's approach, it was super methodical. They didn't just throw the doors wide open overnight. Nope. They started with agriculture, then they moved on to consumer goods, then they set up these special economic zones with really low wages to attract foreign companies. It was only after all that that they reopened the Shanghai stock market. It was a very calculated, very state-controlled march into the global market. But look, not every country's success story was built on low-wage factories. Not at all. You had other places like Finland and this group that became known as the Asian Tigers. We're talking Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They built their success on something completely different: knowledge. And this brings us to a really important concept: the knowledge economy. An economy where growth isn't just about what you can make in a factory, but about information, ideas, and innovation. Finland is the perfect example here. I mean, think about it. In the 1950s, it was mostly a farming nation. By the 90s, it's a tech powerhouse. How? They poured money into education. They decided to compete with brains, not just cheap labor. But for a huge part of the world, the biggest story of globalization was exactly that: the shift of labor. We're talking about factories moving from developed countries to developing ones, all in the hunt for lower costs. A classic example of this happened right on America's doorstep.
After the North American Free Trade Agreement, you probably know it as NAFTA, was signed in 1994, these factories called maquiladoras just exploded in Mexico. The setup was simple. American and Canadian companies could use lower-cost Mexican labor to build their products and then ship them back north without paying any tariffs.
But the search for even cheaper labor didn't stop at Mexico. It just kept going, creating this ripple effect all across Asia. New manufacturing powerhouses popped up in places like Bangladesh and Vietnam. They basically became the world's new factories for things like clothes and electronics, often with wages that made even China look expensive.
So this new global system, it wasn't just being run by governments anymore. A whole new set of players emerged. We're talking about massive international organizations and even bigger corporations. They became the new, incredibly powerful architects of the modern economy.
One of the key players here is the World Trade Organization, the WTO. It was set up in 1995, and its job is basically to be the global referee for trade. It writes the rules for almost all international trade. But man, has it been controversial. Critics argue that its rulebook is tilted to help big corporations, often at the expense of workers and the environment. And then, of course, you've got the multinational corporations themselves, the MNCs. You know the names, giants like Microsoft and Google. But it's also about rising powers from other parts of the world, like India's Mahindra and Mahindra. These companies don't just operate in one country, they're all over the globe, tapping into labor and customers everywhere. And the impact of all this? Absolutely staggering. Just look at India. After it opened up its markets in the early 90s, foreign investment just flooded in. And the result? By 2014, its middle class had ballooned to an estimated 350 million people. That's not just economic growth. That is a societal transformation on a scale that's almost hard to wrap your head around. So that brings us to today. Where does all this leave us? After decades of this supercharged globalization, the debate over whether it was a good thing or a bad thing is louder than ever. Was it a story of amazing progress, or was it a story of peril? Honestly, the evidence seems to point in both directions at once. You can see the core tension pretty clearly. On one hand, globalization fueled incredible growth. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and filled our stores with all sorts of affordable stuff. But on the other hand, it's been blamed for terrible working conditions, major environmental damage, and for completely gutting industrial towns in wealthier countries. This perspective, which you hear from Senator Bernie Sanders here, really gets to the heart of that critique. The argument is basically this. Free trade isn't really fair trade when it pits a worker in one country against someone somewhere else who's making just pennies an hour. It taps into this really deep feeling that the whole system is rigged for corporations, not for regular people. Now, here's a more academic take, and it really acknowledges both sides of that coin. It confirms that, yeah, companies and workers who are able to adapt to this new global world, they did really, really well. But it also lays out the blunt reality for those who couldn't. Their jobs were gone, plain and simple. Globalization created a very clear line between the winners and the losers. And so we end up right back where we started. We've seen the incredible growth, the amazing new technologies, the millions lifted out of poverty, but we've also seen the closed down factories, the tough working conditions, and the growing gap between the rich and the poor. For some, it has absolutely been a decent choice. For others, it's been a deeply, deeply flawed one. And the real question it leaves for all of us is, what's next?